You're watching or listening to Word in Your Ear. Of course you are, as you're never alone with a show that alights upon everything ever invented in the art of conversation. Whether that's regrettable rock and roll footwear, daft things audiences do, epic stage names, tracks to play at wedding parties, or the outer limits of Elmer Gantry's Velvet Opera. Do leave a like or subscribe by going to patreon.com/Word in Your Ear to discover further delights on offer. And now, get stuck into this. Welcome to this and another lavish and frankly beautiful, gorgeous, beautifully designed publication that proves that old reviews and news stories and press cuttings can turn up more fresh revelations than any number of new biographies. It's called Led Zeppelin, The Only Way to Fly, and it's by an old pal of the podcast, Richard Morton Jack. Richard, lovely to see you again.
Likewise, thanks for having me on.
Very good. Now, we did a book of yours like this before called Pressing News, which was terrific as well. This is about a year or two ago. Explain the concept of these books and how you go about them.
Well, the concept of Lansdowne Books, which is the publisher that I started with an old friend of mine, is to share information from the dim and distant past that hasn't necessarily been seen since, and which deserves to be preserved and widely circulated. And when I finished my biography of Nick Drake 3 or 4 years ago, I was trying to think who else I would like to give a similar biographical treatment to. And Led Zeppelin, for me, are the one group of that stature that have never really, in my view, properly been bottomed out. So I started working towards that. And I quickly came up against what I think I'd known subconsciously all along, which is that without access, which they are obviously never going to give, you're always going to be on the outside of the castle walls, kind of peering in, rather than on the inside sitting by the fire, as I have been with the Nick Drake book. So I had all this material from all over the world, and I knew that a lot of it, especially relating to the very earliest part of their career, even before the group had formed, had barely been seen by anyone. So I thought, well, maybe there's another sort of book here where that information is all reproduced and contextualized with what they were doing when, in quite a lot of detail, but without the interview content and the analysis that a biography would aim for.
But how did you come to find this? Because the book is filled with gorgeously designed spread after spread of the old press clippings and little reviews and bits of ephemera and artwork and stuff. So how did you collect all those press clippings? Did you get physical copies of them in the end? or
Yes, I mean, I collect old newspapers and magazines myself. So there was a lot of stuff I already had that I squirreled away as I encountered it, researching other things or working on other projects. A bit of British Library. I mean, Robert Plant, for example, was covered consistently in the Midlands as of about 1965, 66. He was a regular feature of the local papers. So there's a lot of material lurking in things like the Kidderminster Shuttle and Wolverhampton Express and Star, which all add to the picture. They're all little dots on the canvas.
But it's really interesting reading those things. There's such a revelation because, you're so used to the way people write about music today, which is this kind of identity journalism. It's kind of, as someone who feels this way about this music, this is my opinion. And this is just news journalism. It's local reporting. So they're all starting with a blank sheet of paper and they all ask questions about, parents and things like that, which I think is really revealing. There's a lovely interview with John Paul Jones where they say John Paul Jones's parents were travelling entertainers and he was a choir boy and then he was a church organist. And you think that's really interesting,
Yes. And often when there's a piece about, say, Robert from 1966, it will say that he was educated at King Edward's Grammar School and that his parents live at number X, gives their home address.
Yes.
It's just a formula that local journalists had for interviewing anyone or mentioning anyone. They gave basic information about their history. It's quaint, and it takes you straight back into that moment.
We'll drop in a couple of spreads to give people an idea on the YouTube version of what it looks like. But it is so interesting that, that each piece is, because there's no internet, particularly in local press, people are sort of almost starting with a blank sheet of paper each time, and it takes a really long time for a group to get any information about themselves out there, because there's no central hub. You can't just say, who are these people, and this is the story so far. You've got to go out and start again. So there's lots of examples of them being described. Led Zeppelin, I think, and Led Zeppelin, and they can't even get their name right.
Yeah, it's ironic, given that they dropped the A from their name deliberately so that people would pronounce it correctly. But there were an incredible number of manglings in the early days of their name. People, especially in America, seemed utterly unable to spell either word. So you do get this lovely sense of no one having a clue who they were, which obviously quickly came to an end. But the period covered in this book just takes them up to the end of 1969. And in that year, they were still largely obscure. I mean, Jimmy Page on the totem pole of rock gods was nowhere near as high up as, Clapton and Jeff Beck. And people had heard of him, but really they were starting from scratch with a new name, going out for less money than they would have as the Yardbirds. And they knew that. And there's a fun sense of them, conquering town by town as they went.
Yeah, he talks about taking, I think, a 2/3 pay cut to join the Yardbirds because he was working, and he gives all this detail. Everyone's really interested in the details, as we are. That he got £7 a session. I think he did, or was it £9 a session? Did 7 sessions a week or something. So you could work out that his basic wage was £60 just from sessions. He did loads of other stuff, and so to join the Yardbirds was, really kind of belt tightening stuff, wasn't it?
Yes, absolutely. But he was a man with a mission. And the first Led Zeppelin record, as we all know, was, I think it's quite easy to forget now quite how revolutionary that record was. Just the sight of it, quite apart from anything else, this huge phallic symbol. And also, to make a crude comparison, I think even today, if someone put the Challenger Shuttle disaster on a record, it would be seen as tasteless.
Yes, it would.
Back then, the Hindenburg disaster was only 30 years old. It was quite a statement to stick that on a record jacket. And then, of course, the sound of that record was so new. Not necessarily the material, but the way that it sounded, the recording, the engineering, and also the mixture of acoustic and electric instruments was so deft. And, of course, the musicianship was great. But so I think it was tailored for American FM radio and for maximum impact. And Page had it all mapped out. He's a wily guy. He was one step ahead. He'd spent his time in the Yardbirds, especially in America, noticing and thinking and watching. Meanwhile, anchored to these bandmates who were bored and blasé and wanted to do other things. So he was absolutely full of ideas, but he needed another set of musicians to fulfill them with.
Yes, you pick up on that in your text very accurately, and I think the odd person in Melody Maker's on it too, that Page had this kind of vision. So what he's doing is assembling the component parts. And my feeling about it is that a lot of it was to do with the size of the venues, actually, and the tour circuit in America, because tour circuit in America was so much bigger. And when Cream had gone out there before, they kind of struggled because they just didn't have the amplification, and their music was just a little tiny bit too complicated. And he'd obviously worked out you need these huge linear sounds to be able to reach these bigger venues. That was part of it, wasn't it?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, they were dogged in their early days, and they often denied that they were filling the vacuum that had been left by Cream. I think musically that they were quite different to Cream. But in terms of the itch they were scratching for the youth of America, I think that's where the comparison is quite apt. These big venues full of kids who were a bit further down the line in terms of mobility than English kids. They were driving, and their rituals were a bit different. These kids wanted to be entertained for 2 or 3 hours at length, but the psychedelic era had come to an end, or was coming to an end. But they still wanted the communal experience, the gathering together to listen to long but slightly louder and cruder music. And Page was straight onto that like a shot. But there's a wonderful sense in the early days of Zeppelin, which can't really be compared to their superstardom, when they were still working it out as they went. And of course, the wider rock scene was working it out too. People didn't really know how things were going to go, what was going to work, whether anything was even going to last. There's an amazing interview with Page in the book where he says that, Led Zeppelin's probably going to last a couple of years. Then I'm going to go back to painting in about 1971. I'm hoping we'll get 2 or 3 records out. If that was the shelf life he was still imagining.
Yeah.
And of course, in America, you see this by the fact that they played these crazy gigs. So it wasn't huge, great sports amphitheaters endlessly. They played, off the top of my head, they played an ice rink in Las Vegas where the dressing room was literally ice on the floor. Everyone was absolutely freezing. They played a sort of carnival tent called the Music Carnival, which was just a great big cavernous tent with ghastly acoustics. They played a theme park called Pirates World in Florida. They played something called the Aqua Theatre, which was surrounded by water with the fans were in boats or swimming while they played. And there's an element of absurdity and indignity to this, the sort of Spinal Tap puppet theatre vibe.
But there's also an element of just thinking we've only got a limited time, we might as well just go for it, because I can't believe
they were
how much
doing what they had to do.
They play. It's astonishing the amount they played.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and it's also interesting, I think, that Britain, through the press clippings that you run and the music press stuff, it seems to be just behind the beat. They don't quite get the group. And they're not prepared. I mean, there's a bit where somebody writes the Melody Maker, I think, saying they went to see them in Cardiff at some ballroom, and he's not allowed in because he's not wearing a collared shirt and tie. You think this is just, we are a bit behind here. In America, as you say, they've got these places where people are driving to them and all the kids are assembling, and it's just a little bit reactionary, isn't it?
It was a bit more parochial in the UK, and I think the curfews were a bit different. So it was a different experience. And the early days of Led Zeppelin, again, as the book, you'll see cuttings, the skinhead movement was very popular in 1969. And getting your head kicked in was a reality if you're a musician. I mean, Robert Plant had his nose broken, had his nose broken by then, by, yobs outside a gig. And that sort of aggro was quite common in England, but also I think a lot of the kids in England, the culture was different. They had long working weeks or whatever. They wanted to hear hits. They wanted to hear songs they could dance to, and the sort of bludgeoning long workouts didn't quite come across immediately. But also the venues were small. The acoustics were terrible. The Toby Jug in Tolworth, it just couldn't handle John Bonham. And whilst in theory we'd have all killed to go back in time and see them in such places, the reality is that the acoustics,
they wouldn't have sounded at all good, and
the audience were probably at the bar chatting because there was that blasé-ness to the English rock fan.
Yes, certainly English rock.
Complaining. Yeah, I mean, there's hilarious.
The big debate is about, it's so funny, there's a big debate in the music press is about heaviness. It's about heavy music and the concept of what's heavy and whether heavy is essentially a good thing or a bad thing. That's that's the metric that they're being measured against. How heavy are they? In fact, Mick Jagger, refuses to have them on the bill, I think, at Rock and Roll Circus, although they're offered, because he thinks they might be too heavy.
Yes. And of course, they had no idea what heavy actually meant by that point. I mean, things got a lot heavier with Sabbath and the 70s.
And Butterfly.
Grand Funk, yeah.
That's great. Right.
But Page was always moaning about venues not being good enough, the acoustics not being good, audiences standing at the bar eating crisps when they were playing. And you can measure it, again, by the fact that in America, the bands they were sharing bills with straight away in 69 were the likes of Iron Butterfly, Vanilla Fudge, Alice Cooper, who were yet to be stars, but were an interesting proposition, obviously. Whereas in England, they were playing with totally obscure groups, many of whom didn't make records. Smokey Rice, Kimmler Taz, names that simply haven't survived. And I think Page was probably aware that Frosty Moses were not the sort of group that he wanted to be on a bill with. And the sort of venues that were available for a larger audience, like the Roundhouse, again, were quite unsatisfactory from his page of view. They were freezing, they were drafty, the sound boomed around the walls. Suddenly you get to America where it's warm, the audience is really into it. I think also there was, it's been slightly overlooked, but it occurred to me as I was going through all these things that we talk about the British invasion as that 1964 moment. with Dave Clark 5.
That's right.
Beatles downwards.
Animals.
But actually, there was another British invasion in 1969 with Savoy Brown, 10 years after, Jethro Tull, John Mayall, and of course Led Zeppelin as the biggest example. These groups were massive in America, bigger than they were in the UK. Maybe not in Tull's case, but they were huge in both. But these groups were absolutely selling out decent-sized venues straight away in America. There was that appetite amongst American youth for this heavy, bluesy, bludgeoning rock and roll. And in England, that they were a little bit behind. To the extent that the first Led Zeppelin album came out in America a couple of months before it came out in England. England wasn't exactly an afterthought, but America was.
I know there's a bit in Melody Maker, I think, where they published, this is in around Christmas 1968. So let's not forget, this is after Led Zeppelin's second album have come out, and they have the brightest hopes for the future. I think the brightest hope was... I think it's Blind Faith. Second is Thunderclap Newman. The third group is Jethro Tull, and fourth is Led Zeppelin, which again seems just extraordinary. But I suppose it was an indication that they just weren't as big in Britain at that time as you just imagined they were. But they weren't. They were just bigger in America, weren't they?
Yes, I think they became very popular in Britain very quickly over the course of that year. But in late '68, and again something they never stopped moaning about, they have a slightly faulty memory. Led Zeppelin, the three of them, and Peter Grant while he was alive, and I dare say John Bonham would have joined them in this. There's a strange contradiction. They were the most popular, and I would say the best group of their sort, and they were widely loved by fans all around the world, but it was never enough for them. For some reason, they nursed this grievance that they hadn't always been loved and patted on the head and complimented for exactly the right things that they wanted to have been recognised for. And they never forgot it. And I think over time, over the decades since, that has festered for them. And it's fascinating hearing them talk now about how everyone hated us. In England, no one wanted us. It's just not true. It's fascinating.
It still does. I totally agree. And the pattern that emerges from reading that stuff is that in Britain, early on, the feeling is trying to understand what they're trying to do because they're a little bit further than the kind of scale of values that the rock press has at the time. So they're not absolutely applauding them, but they're really interested in what they're doing. And Page has got a reputation, and we know him of old, and let's see what he's up to. And when they become successful, particularly in America, there's a certain amount of resentment then. And then the same thing happens in America, that they're really enthusiastic. And then when they become really successful, you get this whole thing about Rolling Stone. Rolling Stone had to employ, didn't they, Cameron Crowe, age whatever he was, 15 or 16, in order to cover groups like Led Zeppelin, because all the old guard really hated them. And
they're brilliant. But if one goes back to the facts of the matter, which are in the book, Rolling Stone was quite new in 1968, 69. It had only started publication in November 67. It was reasonably late to the party for the rock press in those days. And in 1968, it regularly ran a little snippet in its review section saying, "Would you like to be a Rolling Stone reviewer? Send us some examples of your work and we'll print them." Hard to believe now, given how seriously Rolling Stone took itself thereafter. So one guy who was reviewing for the Daily Bruin, which was a university newspaper in California, was John Mendelsohn, complete unknown at the time. And he sent in a couple of reviews he had written for the Daily Bruin in February 69, one of which was a very rude review of the first Led Zeppelin record, which Rolling Stone simply ran. This didn't reflect an editorial position on Rolling Stone's part. It just reflected the fact that it was an articulate, impassioned review, quite funnily expressed, which they needed to fill up a page with.
Still often quoted today.
Absolutely. Yeah. That review is ground zero for Led Zeppelin's relationship with the press. And it's very unfortunate because John Mendelsohn was entirely within his rights to dislike them and think they were inferior to the Jeff Beck group and all the other things he said. Yeah. But Led Zeppelin, instead of shrugging it off, instead of saying, well, you win some, you lose some, it really wounded them. I suppose Rolling Stone was regarded as quite a prominent place in which to be insulted, but they never forgot it. And it's coloured their whole memory of the ecstatic reviews they got elsewhere. They're all in the book, and you can see people would have died, most groups then and now, for the reviews that album was getting. They've never heard anything like it. This is a turning point in rock. You go on and on, you can see them all. Thereas nothing. Page was absolutely wounded, as they all were, by this one review.
And you're so right that he's still the same, actually. I think all three of them are, but particularly Page. He's still really bitching about it. And as you say, it's simply not true. I think it's interesting, actually, that he always gives the impression that he didn't kind of talk to the press, it was very kind of lofty and high-handed, we're kind of above it. But actually, you look at that early stuff, of course, they did immense amounts of publicity. You had to. And in fact, a completely different species of human being had to be in what I suppose you would then still probably call showbiz, because, you've got a clipping of Jimmy Page in a news piece talking about a 4-poster bed that he's bought, if you'd said to a member of the Arcade Fire even, by the way, being in this group might involve you to have to go talk about the 4-poster bed. They go, I don't do that kind of thing. I'm just, I'm a lute player. And it's really interesting how much they put themselves back. In fact, tell us about the Robert Plant, because Robert Plant was a real press hustler, wasn't he?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think there's an interesting separate conversation to be had about the difficulties of making a success of yourself if you were in Manchester or Glasgow or Birmingham compared to London. And I think Robert Plant, being a Midlands guy, had reached the top, had gone as far as he could in the Midlands reasonably quickly, because obviously he had this extraordinary voice. One of the things which is really baffling if one thinks of it is and one of the miracles of Led Zeppelin is that Plant was available. I mean, Page couldn't believe it, and Page is on the record as saying, I assumed he must just have an obnoxious personality, because how could he not have been signed up by one of my rivals by now? But the answer is, I think, partly because the Midlands, there was just not enough communication between London and the Midlands, and Plant was, I think, bumping his head up at the top of that scene quite quickly. He was a local celebrity, but that wasn't anything nationally. And it was hard to break in London without any infrastructure there. So what happened was that Plant had a manager called Mike Dolan, who's a fascinating character I'd love to speak to more. He concocted an absolute string of publicity stunts, which Plant was very happy to go along with. And this image of the Viking rock god, who's, the coolest man on the planet, is slightly undermined by the fact that, admittedly, as a late teenager now, we're talking about a 17-year-old, 18-year-old, he was doing really quite dumb stunts, like claiming that Harold Macmillan was going to come to one of their gigs, joining the Noise Abatement Society.
That's right.
He was prosecuted for driving without care and attention, pulling out into a junction. And
there was a factory strike going on.
There was a factory strike.
But offered to play, and the factory just turned to,
Yes, they turned up to play to some striking workers and got told to F off in no time at all. He had this traffic conviction, and he had to go to court where he represented himself, which tells you something about his confidence as a young guy. But in no time at all, they'd orchestrated an ill-attended legalised pot rally outside the magistrate's court. No doubt Robert Plant approved of the legalised pot movement, but I don't think he was a particularly big stoner. This was just publicity. Yeah. And the Chinese embassy, he'd hand-delivered a letter to the Chinese embassy saying that the Band of Joy were willing to travel to China to play for free, to,
hands across the water, cultural expansion. Yeah.
Absolutely. Now, of course, they all knew all this was cobblers. It was just column inches. And Tony Secunda, who had had such success with the move from the Midlands with the same approach, was obviously the model. And you can see that Plant was just, and he did have the talent to back it up, so the frustration must have been real. But Plant was doing whatever he could to draw attention to himself, but it wasn't enough. And by the summer of '68, he was pretty much high and dry with a pregnant girlfriend. And I think that's another really interesting aspect about musicians of this era, actually. Often they had families very young. And so Plant, for all that one thinks of him as a young buck, kind of astride the Viking ship sailing to new lands and so on, he was married with a kid, and he had to provide. And the same goes for John Bonham. John Bonham had a kid in 1966. I mean, he was well into his family life by the time Zeppelin came along. But anyway, so when Page said to Plant, well, I'm looking to form a new version of the Yardbirds in sort of June, July 68. I mean, this was last chance saloon for Plant before he had to probably cut his hair off and go back to an office job, because he had a baby on the way and he had absolutely nothing to show for his previous 3 or 4 years of really working quite hard on the local music scene. So the miracle of Page, first of all, being put onto Plant by Terry Reid, and then Plant saying, oh, I've got a mate who plays the drums, who turns out to be the best drummer in that style imaginable. That's a fairy story like the Beatles, if you ask me. I mean, and Page must have thought to himself, this is more than he had ever dreamed of.
It is. I think about John Bonham particularly, actually, because John Bonham, the other three, you could see why they were kind of part of it, but he kind of came as part of a package, and he turned out to be astonishing, just absolutely astonishing.
Absolutely.
Playing like a kind of lead instrument throughout.
And perfect for them as well.
Yeah.
Perfect for Page. And of course, Jones, who always generously praises Bonham, well, not generous, but he always lavishly praises Bonham. And Jones himself was free. I mean, that's a great thing too.
Yes. And had a lot to give up too. I mean, he was just so in demand as a session writer and arranger, you know.
Well, something fascinating about Jones, who's obviously the least talked about member of the group traditionally because he has said the least, and is the least sort of obviously attention drawing. Jones had been backing Dusty Springfield in Cabaret, and that was a repetitive gig, but the sort of thing he did as a jobbing musician. And at exactly the moment that Page was forming Led Zeppelin in the summer of 68, Dusty was in Cabaret at the Talk of the Town in London, the Hippodrome, singing the same set every night, doing the same things in the same places, after a group of women dressed up as birds had done the previous act. And into Led Zeppelin. I mean, amazing, really. So one can understand the fact that Jones thought there was more to life than this. But he was free. That's the main thing. And at exactly the moment that Page needed these guys, they all just dropped out of the sky into his, lap. Bassist, drummer.
Drop out of the sky. Boom. That's right. I remember I interviewed Jones once. He was telling me about the moment that their first rehearsal, and they started playing Train Kept a Rolling, I think it is. And they, within 30 seconds, are all looking at each other and just thinking, this is absolutely extraordinary. And that was, I suppose, would have been August 1968. So the name of the group didn't appear till whatever, autumn 68. And yet you have found clippings about a group called Led Zeppelin, spelled L-E-A-D, is that right, in Ohio in February 1968. So that's a weird coincidence.
Well, earlier
there was a group called Led Zeppelin.
Yes, and I think they were junior high students. Amazingly, they only seem to ever to have played at the youth club dance at the junior high school in Coshocton, Ohio. So I think that what's interesting, I mean, it's funny, it's a footnote that there was a previous group called Led Zeppelin, although sadly they didn't record, and I haven't been able to find out anything about them, but they played numerous gigs for months on end in this small town. But what's quite interesting is that Led Zeppelin was a phrase. If you look through old newspapers and press releases, people did say, well, that'll go down like a Led Zeppelin at work on Monday morning. I mean, it was an actual phrase.
It wasn't something just invented by whatever Keith Moon or whoever it was meant to be.
He just said it would be funny to call a group that, but he didn't. Yes. It was the phrase had been in existence since the 1930s. It was just quite witty to call a group after that in a self-deprecating way, and it sounded a bit mysterious. But the Coshocton, Ohio students didn't take the A out, so they were Lead Zeppelin.
Lead Zeppelin, that's right.
Peter Grant, who wittily realised was, cannily realised, would both lead to mispronunciation and didn't look as mysterious. That was quite.
But Page also did, as you say in the book, you kind of fudged some of the details about the group's early career, I think, didn't he?
Well, about his life in general.
His life.
It's quite hard to. I mean, Page is obviously quite enigmatic, shall we say, anyway. He doesn't love having his past raked over in ways that he's not in control of. And that's totally his prerogative. I get that. But going back to his very earliest days as a teenager, he has said different things at different times about when he did what. And it's quite interesting being able to get the actual chronology correct and see when he did actually do things and how it all worked for him. Because the mythology with Page is that he was just straight away into the sessions as a young guy. And actually, he was a jobbing musician for 2 or 3 years with Neil Christian and the Crusaders, traveling around the UK in the early 60s. Again, playing in weird and wonderful places. He played in a Holloway prison at one point. I mean, they did again. Page was well used to doing what you had to do to get your music across. But he was also, keen to be an art student and very conflicted about whether to pursue music or art, partly because his health wasn't great. So trying to work out when he went to art school and when he stopped at art school and because when he tells these things, they all cross over and blur and fudge, and all of the previous books haven't unpicked it properly. And I've done my best to present it as accurate as I can. And I find it quite interesting seeing how the detail of his early career isn't actually as miraculously fortuitous, and his genius wasn't recognized quite as immediately as one might think.
It's an immense amount of slogging around the circuit, isn't it? Carter Lewis,
huge amount
all
of
those
that,
bands that he was in.
And he had nothing to show for it at the end. In 1963, he was completely broke. He was paying off for his guitar on hire purchase, about to go to art college with nothing to show for the 3 years that he had spent in Neil Christian and the Crusaders. Then the sessions came around and it all started to fall into place a bit more for him. So getting that stuff right, and also just little things come to light, such as the fact that Page for a time was going out under the pseudonym Elmer Twitch.
Yes.
It's just interesting. I saw a photo where he's credited as Elmer Twitch, and I thought, hello, that's bizarre. And it turns out to have been an in-joke, and I think partly because he was trying to apply for art school grants and had to be a little bit careful about admitting he was also a jobbing musician.
But also that was a kind of R&B gag at the time, wasn't it? Kind of Brian Jones.
I know the Larry Parnes.
Yeah, all that kind of, I don't know, Elmer Twitch stroke kind of old
Billy
blueser, from Mississippi.
Absolutely. Yes, yeah. But even Jones, whose history, again, one's led to believe it all just happened in a very linear way. It's really interesting seeing that he was in various groups before he became a session man. And
in various groups, and also you point out that he had a stab at a solo career. And I think I managed, possibly, or encouraged by Andrew Oldham, I'm pretty sure, who had a big influence on Page as well. But he puts out a single, doesn't he? Page was...
He did. He's only on the A side, although both sides are credited to him. I mean, it's a typical Oldham curiosity. The B-side's an instrumental called A Foggy Day in Vietnam. I mean,
that's right.
Classic Oldham. But Jones had been touring with Jet Meehan and Jet Harris and Tony Meehan.
Yeah.
They'd had a #1 single. They were big news. Jones was a seasoned touring musician, but he didn't particularly enjoy that, and he was happy to go into being an arranger. But there are other strings to his bow. In 1965, he founded a record label in Ireland with an Irish hustler called Tony Boland, and he was flying back and forth to Dublin a bit, putting out records on this label called Tempo. He's never been asked about that, and being him, he's never spoken about it. But there are these fascinating strings to their bows, and you get the sense that all of them, including Bonham, who one tiny snippet I found says that he had been offered the drum stool in a group called The Foremost, which was one of Brian Epstein's groups.
They were the Liverpudlians, weren't they? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And they were very successful too, very popular, touring and backing other musicians. And Bonham's parents refused to let him do it because they thought he was too young. So all of them had quite storied pasts by the time that they joined Page. And there's a slight sense in which particularly Plant and Bonham have been painted as greenhorns who were suddenly given access to the rock world by Page. And to an extent, flying internationally, staying in hotels, that sort of stuff was novel for them. But in terms of the hard graft of being a musician and working the circuit and knowing what it took, they were absolutely steeped in it, all of them.
Oh, completely. Oh, it's extraordinary. I mean, I think the John Paul Jones stuff is so interesting because he'd had so much experience. There he was kind of represented in a kind of preppy American way. It's really interesting, the coverage. And so much of it's about his looks, because he was fantastic looking. And the women describe him in the press as gorgeous, and the men describe him as handsome. Even the men have to acknowledge this is a very handsome man, you know.
Yes. Yeah,
really interesting.
Yeah, it's funny.
But, so was there anything particularly about any of the four of them that you learned in the process of doing this book that you just simply didn't know before? I mean, you've put in lots of details there about things there, but anything about their characters, or can you think of anything?
Well, as you say, there's plenty of funny little snippets which are amusing or revealing in context. But in terms of the four of them as individuals, no, I think it's more that they gelled so fast and so quickly, but they didn't actually know each other very well. So musically, you had this wonderful symbiosis right away. And in fact, the proof of that, which is really interesting, and I'd be interested to know if there's a better example of this, they recorded their first album barely a month after they'd first been in a room together. I don't think any rock classic has ever been recorded so fast after the members met. So they got along so well, but they didn't actually know each other very well. And you get a sense, reading interviews, the early interviews with them, of them not really being that qualified to speak about each other. They're quite cagey about making statements on each other's behalf. Certainly Page talking about Plant and so on. Yeah. There's one interview in a gentleman's magazine called Cavalier, which I eventually had to buy from a website that sells vintage porn. And I had to fill in practically the Official Secrets Act to guarantee that I was, a bona fide purchaser. I don't know what. It was bizarre in America. And this thing arrived in a brown envelope. Anyway, across two issues of Cavalier in 1969, Page, Plant and Jones were interviewed. That interview's never been seen since. It took a long time for me to find it. So in that interview, though, you can get a real sense of Page and Plant not really knowing where each other's going. Page actually contradicts Plant at one point. They have a friendly disagreement about Frank Sinatra. They just haven't spent that long together. They don't know each other that well. And then
are forced to live in each other's pockets for several years, and
absolutely. And I think that's why the mythologized trip to Bron-Ra in Wales in 1970, when they wrote the third album, they've both said, that was when we were finally able to spend a bit of time just hanging out, sitting by a stream, chatting, going for a walk. That's when they. Yeah,
that's one of those rare moments where we all think that must have been magical, and it clearly was magical. It's one of those things where they just sat around and they're recharging the batteries by putting them by the fire for the cassette machine, and just smoking loads of dope and listening to the incredible string band. It sounded really good.
Whereas in the earlier days, they weren't a fabricated boy band, but they had been put together by Page to his spec, and he was hoping for the best. So very much unlike the Beatles, who had spent God knows how long living in each other's pockets since they were kids, really, and knew each other back to front. And the music had really sort of followed the friendships to an extent with them. Zeppelin, it was all about the music straight away. And if the personalities gelled, that would have been a bonus. But it was about the work ethic and the desire to get the music across. And you get a vivid sense of that. There are other little bits and pieces, like them being accused of setting fire to some curtains in Denmark, and this being a big argument about who should pay for the damage with promoters. There are these lovely little lost glimpses that you get of their career and their experiences happening in real time. One of their first bills in Denmark, on a previous trip to Denmark, actually, their first, when in September 68, they were put on a bill with a group called the Ladybirds, because the promoter thought Yardbirds, Ladybirds, he can promote it as two types of birds. The Ladybirds actually played topless. That was their gimmick. So they were a girl group who, took off their bras, basically. I mean, completely absurd. Must have been a very bonding experience for the Led Zeppelin lads.
It would.
Hilarious, weird, but they had to crack on, do what they had to do to get to the next steps, get the set together and so on. So I love the sense from these cuttings of history unfolding in real time, and of seeing these little, you can infer so much from these absurd situations they were in.
Well, it really, really works. I loved it. I would thoroughly recommend it. It's, as you say, you see the whole story developing chronologically. And in these tiny little local press interviews, you discover extraordinary things about them that you didn't know. And you'll love this book also because it's full of examples of puns based on the word Led Zeppelin in headlines. Lift off and flying high and hot air and all. In fact, this book itself, The Only Way to Fly, is guilty of the same, quite rightly. It's fantastically good. Thanks so much, Richard. It's lovely to talk to you. And
Thanks
good
so
luck
much,
with it
Mark.
all.